Hey everyone, most of you will know that my day job, I'm a writer. I'm so much more used to the writing style of making announcements or discussing topics. Discussing things on video is relatively new for me, and I'm still learning. The video you're about to watch is one that I started writing the script for, and I just kept on writing, and I kept on writing, and it came to nearly 10,000 words. And I didn't really have a good way of presenting it. So I've done it kind of podcast style, and there's text that you can follow along with. This topic is going to be about how the media and the vendors and the companies interact together to generate content, reviews, and such. This was all written and it was actually recorded well before the recent incident between Hardware Unboxed and NVIDIA. But the same concepts still stand. It's important to note that, there are certain issues which go beyond normal, and the Hardware Unboxed situation was beyond normal. I think they handled it quite well, and it was good to see the media landscape all bind together in that context. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a video on Hardware Unboxed. Linus has a good portion of his recent WAN show dedicated to the topic, where he's very passionate about the whole concept. And, I applaud him for being that passionate and speaking out about it. So here's a video on how the tech media and vendors work together. Hope you enjoy it. What's your minimum specification? Alright guys, how's it going? One of the often opaque relationships in the tech media space is between the publisher, the journalist, or the content creator with the big name tech companies. From the outside, it might simply look like your favorite content creator emails a company for a product to review, for sponsored content, or to sell advertising, while the interaction is purely between those two company entities. It's never that simple, and I won't go into details here. Part of what has put this to the forefront of my mind recently was a story of a YouTube channel called TechTeamGB and its relationship with MSI. TechTeamGB is a channel run by Andrew McDonald, with almost 100,000 subscribers, and it regularly reviews computer hardware for the audience, as well as covers some of the new items in the industry. As part of the regular churn of things, Andrew reviewed an MSI laptop and found that his results, in his own words, were disappointing. He reached out to his MSI contacts, as is a usual ethical procedure when a product doesn't even hit the basic level of requirements, in order to verify the results he achieved. With benchmarking, there's very little that can be argued, unless the unit is a dud, which does happen sometimes, but if all the results are correct, there was potential room for misinterpretation. MSI asked Andrew to wait, presumably to either double-check the numbers, provide Andrew with a second sample for verification, or something along those lines. According to Andrew, MSI strung him out over a number of weeks, being very non-committal about everything, which one would naturally attribute to a delay tactic such that the review is no longer relevant for a product that has been out in the market. To Andrew's astonishment, his MSI contact requested that he did not post the review. This contact happened over WhatsApp, and then called him to offer him a financial incentive to thank him for his time for reviewing the product, and then requested that he disclose the arrangement to no one else. Obviously, this throws up a number of red flags for a variety of reasons. There are the obvious ones, such as paying for content or being disingenuous when flaws are found on a product in the marketplace, and then there are the ethics of it all. Part of this video, I want to talk about the actual reasons why MSI would do something like this, or to be clearer, why someone who works for MSI would do this. It will become obvious later what I mean by distinguishing between the two. Ultimately, Andrew had two options. The bad one of taking the money and not posting his review, or posting the review and potentially angering MSI to the point where he would no longer be sampled for future reviews. For smaller content creators, either on YouTube or for websites or print, losing some relationships can have a negative effect on your ability to grow, and so there is always an element of that in the back of your mind as whether this would have any long-term effects. Andrew ultimately did the right thing. He declined MSI's offer and published the review on his YouTube channel, and I encourage you to check it out. Links are in the description. After the review went live, the MSI representative got in contact with Andrew again, this time by phone. They requested that Andrew change the title of his review in order for it to appear less negative. He declined, stating that it was an accurate representation and he had given MSI more than enough time to address his comments. His representative then responded with what can be described as a threat, that there would be no more review samples and no more sponsorships if he did not comply. Andrew again declined. To turn the matter on its head, Andrew then got a call from his AMD press representative, as MSI had got in contact with them, MSI actually went through AMD sales, and it went through there to AMD PR. MSI had requested that AMD get involved to take down the review. AMD refused and called to let Andrew know. After this, Andrew posted his experience on Twitter, links in the description. As you might expect, he received an outpouring of support, not only from his audience, but from big content creators and other press. Hardware Unboxed and Gamers Nexus also reported on the story in specific videos, detailing some of their own experiences and how both brands are currently blacklisted by ASRock, funnily enough. MSI's representative clearly had not heard about the Streisand effect, where trying to limit potentially damaging news actually blows a story wide open, and MSI were pressured into making an official statement. In that statement, MSI acknowledged that there was inappropriate communication, but only apologised for the communication flow. The company stated that they implemented an internal investigation to ensure that it doesn't happen again, and a commitment to move to an external PR agency for UK notebook communications. Andrew also got a direct call from MSI at the time after he posted on Twitter, although apparently contact since the event has been somewhat minimal now. So this all ties into how does the press-vendor relationship work, especially if you're new to this space. Now I know that's a long intro, perhaps one of the worst confrontations with a tech company I've heard of, but I want to break down exactly how do we go about doing what we do, and how the companies we work with are geared to deal with the press. Let's start at the super high level. There are two very simple blocks. One block is your press member or a content creator, and the other block is a technology company, with a very simple line of contact between the two. From the outside, this is probably what it appears like. Now, the technology company wants to create excitement about an upcoming product or a new product that has just come to the market, and there are many ways that the company can approach this. They could, 1. Throw out press releases on the wire and through email lists, hoping that content creators and the press see them and create news stories about the fancy upcoming product. Number 2. They can directly buy advertising to promote the product in the form of banner ads, pre-rolled ads, or something similar. Number 3. They could pay for sponsored content. They can pay a news outlet or a YouTube channel for their time to create content about a product, usually in a positive way. This could be in the form of a sponsored content review, or depending on the product, it might be a way to develop interesting content about how the product should or shouldn't be used. This is sometimes known as native advertising. Or number 4, get content creators or press to review the product, with the potential reviews being positive or negative. Now for each of these 4 points, there are also extra layers to consider, and I'll go through these one by one. So the first point is press releases. Press releases appear very simple. They are often explanations and marketing around a product designed to help the journalist understand what it is and how they can tailor the news item to the audience. These companies usually attach high-quality images and logos to the press release, and they often offer email addresses in case the press needs more information, for example, technical information for a technical audience. Technology companies also do in-advance briefings about their products. This is where they will offer the press or the content creators the required materials in advance of a product announcement, on the proviso that they hold the information under an embargo until a specified time or date. This allows all of those involved to ask the questions that they need to and prepare their coverage, such that the coverage goes live across all press at the same time. As is often the case with press and content creators, being first is a key strategy to drive traffic and views, so having an agreed embargo time keeps the playing field level. I've done a video series about NDAs and embargoes, which you can watch in the links below. In-advance briefings might be as simple as presenting the information, but may also involve hands-on with the products in question, or even review samples. We'll cover that later in the video. Now, number 2 is buying advertising. One of the oldest ways to generate income as a journalist is to sell advertising. Advertising basically greases the wheels. Whether it's a banner advertisement on a website, a quarter-page takeout of a newspaper, a full page in a glossy magazine, or a pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll advertisement. The point is to dedicate a particular space or time of which that is dedicated to the company. Basically, you want eyeballs on a specific location or time. Advertisements are almost universally created by the company who is buying them, though they often have to adhere to strict rules for the publication they are buying the ad space from. In the YouTube world, the content creator is often the one that makes the pre-roll ad in order to keep it the same style as the rest of their content. So this is where we start splitting up a high-level block diagram of press and company. Instead of it being simply one block for press and one another for the tech company, I'm going to create layers within the press section and describe some of the differences between independent and publisher arrangements. Let's start by making that press section becoming publisher or a parent company and moving out to a brand. So you might consider that Linus Media Group is the parent company, but Linus Tech Tips and Tech Quickie or Floatplane might be considered different brands or companies headed up by that parent. Publishers run their own sales departments independent of the brands, and we'll put this in here as well. You may have heard that the golden rule of journalism ethics is that the journalist should be nowhere near where the money for advertising is taking place. This is essentially the layout I'm presenting. The sales department at a publisher is the one that negotiates the costs for advertising space and sells the advertising spots for each of the individual brands. At no point, this is in an ideal world, should the journalists who work at those brands ever know who is buying advertising at any given time. The only time they know when a particular company is buying advertising is when they see it in print, like the readers. Or in the YouTube space, it might be the video editor's job to add in the pre-roll advertisement, and the host may never know. Or the host may have actually created a bunch of pre-roll ads and doesn't know exactly which one goes with which video or how many times they are used. Even in a perfect environment, in written media, there is some discussion that goes on between the brand and sales. Typically, the editor-in-chief for a brand might be told in advance if a company has purchased a large advertising campaign for that brand. Or the sales representatives within the publisher might ask how many smartphone reviews were done last quarter, in order to get a sense of how well they can sell future advertising. That separation between ad sales and journalism means that the journalist or content creator shouldn't have to worry about writing positive or negative elements about any company they cover. Typically, advertisers know this, but sometimes they will throw some weight around and pull advertising if it coincides with negative coverage. Whether that's negative coverage, such as something factual like poor sales of a leading product, or subjectively negative coverage over a review of something like a video game, whether or not the advertising is pulled comes down to the company in question. There have been instances in the industry, such as with GameSpot and their large advertising program for Kane & Lynch, while the editor wrote a less than stellar 6 out of 10 review score, where the publisher knee-jerks at the potential lost revenue and fires the journalist or editor if the review isn't changed. Ultimately, companies can decide where or when to buy advertising for publishers, or when not to, or to spend less. Decent publishers will have clauses in those ad contracts such that the advertiser acknowledges that the advertising has no bearing over any coverage of their company or that product in question. That being said, there is one leverageable opportunity that you may or may not agree with. Some companies that buy big advertising contracts with a publisher will suddenly become more amenable to sending review samples. As long as those samples are sent on the understanding that their advertising campaign has no sway in the review, this is usually in the clear. There have been times when I've been told indirectly by our sales team that Company X has purchased a lot of ads. They were wondering if any of their products interest you for a review or for use in your testbeds. Talk to them if you want anything. So depending on my schedule, there might be opportunities to do unique coverage or reviews that we might not have done in the past, such as high-end reviews or an opportunity to cover a spectrum of products in a particular category, or they may facilitate reviews already in progress. The point at which the company starts paying directly for content, however, is called sponsored content, or native advertising. We'll cover this in the next section. I would like to say a small word on smaller content creators. I've been speaking about this from a publisher level, with multiple employees. For smaller creators or independents, they may not have separate people in charge of advertising and content, especially if it's just a one-person show. Then that person has to wear all the hats. In that respect, it can get difficult to have a distinct separation between ads and content when they're in the mind of the same person. Tech companies sometimes take advantage of this, which is unfortunate. So moving on to point 3, sponsored content. In the marketing industry, sponsored content is sometimes called native advertising, but don't let that name fool you. Have you ever been reading a magazine, seen an innocent-looking piece, got deep into the article, only to find that it says this content was sponsored by? If you had that knowledge in your mind before you started reading, would your thoughts about the article change? Would you even read the article? Welcome to the world of native advertising. The goal of native advertising is to present the opinion of the company, not the publisher or the brand, in a way that makes the content appear as if it was from the publisher, the magazine, or the website directly. It is ultimately premium content that a sponsor pays a publisher to create and distribute. Sometimes the content can obtain objective metrics, or the publisher/content creator actually creating the content can do their own tests. But everything said in these types of pieces should always be considered first-party provided direct from the manufacturer marketing. This is ultimately what the sponsor is paying for. In the UK, we have strict rules with respect to sponsored content or native advertising. Any content which comes under these two headings has to be clearly marked as an advertisement, so the readers or the watchers are not misled. The rules in the US are not as strict, But this is often why you'll see multi-regional coverage use things like #ad in their social media posts, or the content in the YouTube title says sponsored by Intel or something similar. There is some debate, even among the audience, whether the advertising declaration should be in the title, within the first few seconds of the video, or merely in the description. Ultimately, the rules are still in flux, especially with the internet in play. I'm from the UK, where the rules are very strict, so I don't often look too kindly when I'm being misled. That said, sponsored content often pays higher than advertising, and for the consumer can still be worth reading or watching. If LG were to turn around and say, "We want you to make a custom 10-minute video about our monitors, and we'll pay you some money. Send us some ideas," they might accept a proposal to do something like a 360-degree igloo gaming setup. It would be fun to watch, but ultimately that video would still be an advertisement for LG. And we would have to consider that the video wouldn't be able to be made because LG might not normally sample that many products if it wasn't sponsored content. I will say that attitudes to sponsored content do differ depending on the medium. In print, in a magazine, it's more or less acceptable to do as long as it's not over the top. For an online magazine, however, such as AnandTech, it is almost overwhelmingly negative due to the objective third-party nature of content with online media sites. That being said, when AnandTech has run a few sponsored posts in the past, written by third parties at the publisher, there have been distinct acknowledgements that they are okay if they remain infrequent, but helps the site to keep the lights on and editors in a good supply of chips. On YouTube, sponsored content comes in two forms. First, the blatant advertisement depends on the creator. If you're a creator for which a lot of content is subjective, then the blatant advertisement can easily be passed off as being in a similar style. The other type of sponsored content is similar to what I mentioned with the LG monitor scenario. That is usually seen as very, very positive. Yet if I was to do the same content on AnandTech with a sponsored by LG lead, I would argue it wouldn't necessarily go down too well. The original goal of sponsored content, or native advertising, was to fool the customer into thinking they were watching or reading an independent presentation about the product, when actually the reality is very different. That kind of sticks in my throat a little. Now the fourth area is reviews. For a company getting coverage about a new product, reviews is typically one of the angles taken. In the press release for a product, the company may offer a review-like analysis of their own product, along with performance numbers or pseudo-subjective hands-on thoughts. We often call those first-party performance numbers and analysis, because the company has a vested interest in getting the consumer interested in the product. However, the goal of the review strategy is to have those same targets independently verified by those with suitable audiences, with content tailored for those consumers. Tech companies can send out review samples before a launch, as long as the journalist accepts an embargo or NDA, or they will send them out as the product launches. The tech company might only send a few priority press partners at first before seeding others, or they might sample everyone in their press lists. Now this is where the tech company side of that original block diagram we were talking about starts to get tricky. At a broad level, reviews and communications with the press can be dealt with in either two ways. Either they can be managed internally by a press relations or PR team, or an outside firm can be hired, also known as a PR agency. If you've ever heard of the names Edelman, RacePoint Global, Global PR, or Technic PR, these are examples of PR agencies. These PR agencies will take the tech companies on as clients and essentially do the work of PR for them. PR agencies might handle buying advertising space, they might handle review programs, and they might handle relationships with press and analysts, or relationships with content creators and influential personalities, known as influencers, as well as briefings or public events based on their clients and the budgets. Typically, a PR agency will have certain strengths in various areas, and more often than not, they will bid for contracts with clients, where the tech companies that exist. The goal for the PR agency is to convince the client to pay for their services, so they might offer low prices to do so. It's always fun to work with a PR agency who has had to stretch budgets by not hiring enough people because they went aggressive on contract pricing with their clients. In some instances, I know that some tech companies will hire PR agencies for only a year, before taking more bids from other PR agencies and subsequently changing which agency they use every year. When the PR agency changes, it involves creating new contacts with the press, and there's no guarantee that the emailing list has changed over, and in a number of cases, the PR agency that just lost the contact are not allowed to email the press that they do work with, saying that a company is no longer a client. Needless to say, this gets very frustrating, but there are some key agencies I've worked with over the years that have been excellent. So that's an agency. If we go back up to the tech company level, we have internal PR teams and/or agencies that talk directly to the editors and the sales teams. Now, if we think of a small tech company that perhaps has less than 50 people in its staff, They might only have one PR team or one agency to cover their entire world. This means that the press, or the sales teams trying to sell advertising space, all speak to headquarters. Bigger companies do it differently. Most tech companies have regional press relations. The bigger the company, the more subdivided the world is. Some mid-sized companies like ASRock might be split based on North America, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, or EMEA, or Asia Pacific, APAC, plus another one in China. Someone bigger like AMD or Intel will have country-specific PR teams, one for the US, one for Canada, one for the UK, one for Germany, one for Spain. These arrangements might combine smaller countries, such as one team for Australia and New Zealand, one for Benelux, which is Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and so on. AMD has these regional offices, but also holds one for the whole of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, for example, so it becomes layered. The goal of these regional PR teams, or agencies, is that they can work with the local press or local advertising companies to create ads or content specific to that region. When dealing with a single global headquarters PR team, finding the exact combination of what works for Italy, for example, might not be possible, hence why these regional teams exist. Now, each region might deal with an internal PR team for that tech company or with a PR agency. Agonizingly, the PR agency used in each region might be different. For example, a company might use one agency in the UK that specializes in social marketing and print advertising, but the agency used in the US might be better with press relations and review strategy. While this strategy of disjointed PR agencies allows for some optimization regionally, as well as minimizing cost, it can lead to a disjointed array of how different press perceive each of the tech companies in each region. It can also lead to miscommunication if the PR agency in one region has a different philosophy to another region, such as offering financial incentives to stop negative reviews being published. Now, we have to expand this web by another dimension. We've talked about tech companies having different PR teams or agencies for individual countries and regions, but some companies are large enough that each department within a company runs its own PR strategy. For this, we'll take the example of Samsung. So there are many Samsung divisions. Samsung Smartphone, Samsung Storage, Samsung TV, Samsung Foundry are all, for lack of a better term, essentially different companies within the same umbrella. Despite this, Samsung's Smartphone division runs a regional PR agency strategy, whereas the Foundry business is run entirely by a headquarters team and a US team, or at least to my knowledge. Now, you might expect there to be little overlap between Samsung Foundry and Samsung fridges, for example, but for the general gadget press that might be covering both, it means having multiple contacts for the same company, but from different PR agencies. Ultimately, every contact link between a journalist or content creator and a person in the PR team, whether that's directly at the company or through a PR agency, there is some level of rapport between the two. The best relationships are ones based on understanding. Does the PR person understand what the journalist in question needs? And does the journalist understand to what extent the PR person can get what they want? I've seen PR contacts at agencies unwilling to even entertain thoughts outside the norm, based on directives from the management, whether that's the management at the agency or management by the client, whereas I've known contacts that know exactly which person to forward my technical questions to, or can take care of any procedural questions or complications that might arise, for example, in a review strategy. Some PR contacts are abrupt, or purposefully ignore your emails, whereas some can also be too eager, emailing every week about where a review is. It takes all kinds. From the perspective of the journalist or the content creator, it pays dividends in the long run to attempt to understand the goals of the PR contact in question, as well as the limits of what they're able to do and where requests can be made. So with all that in mind, let us address the topic of reviews. Here I'm talking about both pre-launch reviews under embargo and post-launch reviews. The goal of the company, at a high level, is to get as many 5-star super recommendation gold awards as possible when a product is launched. This is regardless of if the product is actually any good or not. Certain companies pride themselves on the thousands of awards they are given by the press each year. Press and content creators will be divided up into categories, such as technical, lifestyle, consumer, tabloid, influencer, and with each category often divided up into tiers. Tier 1 for the highest profile, most important, or for press with the longest lasting relationship, down to as many tiers as they feel is necessary. There may also be a special Tier 0 for the press that the company can guarantee an immediate positive review from. Most PC tech companies also operate a form of global PR team who manage the top 15 to 20 press of each category worldwide. Note that some press feel obligated to give some form of award for every review they do, either because the company they're reviewing are an advertiser, especially if there's no interest between sales and content, or because they see an opportunity to rise to a higher tier or get included in future exclusive announcements. Given that they know the press relations team wants awards, these press find it in their best interest to do this in order to grow and create a business, or maintain their business, especially if it was built on these principles. When it comes down to review samples for a product, there are a few different ways that a company can handle this. However, almost universally implemented is that they will start sampling the top tier of their intended coverage categories. A new TV, for example, might go to the lifestyle tier 1 and the influencer tier 1s before the technical and tabloids get a chance. If we go back to our block diagram, from the tech company perspective, with having different PR teams or agencies for each region, it's important to note that each region will be allocated a specific number of samples. If a company is doing a big launch of 4 to 7 products, then those agencies might only be sampled 1 to 2 products that the parent company is planning to sell in that region. They might get 10 units to distribute for each product, or 50. Even global PR teams might end up with limited units and samples to distribute for reviews. It also means that trying to get answers to questions that only someone at headquarters would know becomes a multi-step process as it gets passed from PR agency to PR team to global PR to engineer product manager and then back again. This sort of email chain can easily take a week. So, with review samples, depending on the company, a sample is usually offered in perpetuity or on some sort of short-term loan. In perpetuity in this context means that the sample doesn't need to be returned when the review is completed, but it must remain within the press company for the purposes of future comparisons. Simply put, the sample shouldn't be sold. It is not a tangible asset for that brand to sign off on their revenue. The products that cost more to ship than they're actually worth fall into this category, such as PC cases, motherboards, depending on the source, and memory. However, a company may allocate a region more samples than is required, and so these are also offered under this scheme. Also, those managed by global PR teams or those that are in the highest tier 1 might also be offered samples in perpetuity where others may not. Some product lines, such as notebooks, pre-built systems, or cars, for the car press, are never offered in perpetuity, unless there is also some underlying agreement related to sponsored content or advertising. More common are short-term loans, wherein a journalist or content creator only gets a limited time with the product before having to return it. Most samples in most categories for most press are provided in this context, especially when there are limited samples for a region. For example, if the Benelux region PR office was only sampled 3 of the latest Samsung Galaxy smartphones for the 20 to 50 press in the region, then each one would be on a short-term loan. These units would naturally be cycled between the press in that region. In some instances, these agreements also include language by which the press will automatically receive a bill of purchase if not returned within a reasonable time. For companies that only offer limited samples to the regional press teams, this is ultimately where frustration sets in for both the agency and for the press. Those that are not tier 1 may only get a sample 8 weeks after launch, by which time it isn't worth covering, or the loan period is only a week, which isn't enough time for proper battery life testing. In this environment, there is no ability for the press to build up review-related relations with the PR agency, in the hope of being sampled earlier for the next cycle of products. From the perspective of the PR agency, their ideal situation when chasing awards is that each member of the press spends 10 minutes with the product, gives an award, and then sends it to the next person. This dichotomy all ends up in a mess. There are times when a member of the press wants to review a sample of something that the PR agency has not been allocated, and the answer is often a simple, "We don't have any." This is despite the PR team or agency working for a company might be selling millions of those products worldwide. The fact that they do not have any to send out is because of the zero allocation, something likely decided several stages above the heads of the person that the press directly speaks to. It's out of the hands of that specific PR team or agency. If the PR contact wants to honour the request, they will often have to buy a retail product out of the advertising funding for the product contract and send it to the press. That may come with caveats such as short-term loans, but that is the only way to do it. To add something else into the mix, some of these companies take regionalization to the very extreme. For regional press organizations, where every editor is contained within that singular region, this is not an issue. There is often one PR contact for that region for each company, and that is very easy to deal with. However, the nature of the internet is no longer confined to lines drawn on a map, even if sales and regulations and press organizations may have different staff over different points of the world. This is where it gets tricky. For most press and content creators, those working with regional PR, the PR region you are meant to deal with is the one where your band is based. So for Linus, that's Canada. For Steve at Gamers Nexus, that's the US. For Steve at Hardware Unboxed, that's Australia, and so on. But if you are a Romanian in Luxembourg, working for an American brand whose parent company is based in the UK, like one of my colleagues is, then it starts to get complicated. If the PR team or agency is highly regionalized, the conversations usually go like this. "Hi UK PR team, I'm based in the UK but I work for a US brand." "Oh, you work for a brand in America? Then go speak to the US PR team." "Hi US PR team, I'm based in the UK but I work for a US brand." "Oh, you're based in the UK? Go speak to the UK PR team, unless you have a colleague based in the US." This sort of hyper-regionalized PR teams and agencies are like this because the contract they are under specify only contact with press based in the region they are covering. If they have targets, such as achieving X number of reviews or Y number of awards, if you are physically outside of that region, even if the brand is based in their region, then those numbers won't count. Moreover, if they send a sample outside of their own region, it legally becomes a quagmire if that journalist somehow breaks that agreement, such as an NDA or refusing to return the sample. For a PR agency, that's a headache best avoided. It also gets more complex if you're physically in a region with one language, but write for a brand that is in a different language. If you somehow manage to convince the regional PR team where you are physically located to talk to you, they will turn off because you don't write in the local language for the region that they cover. Overall, it can get amazingly frustrating as a journalist or content creator if you work for a brand outside your region, especially if that brand is small and trying to make a name for itself. So there are some regional quirks on reviews and things. A couple of aspects to all of this, some of which occur specifically in particular regions. The first term is called Payola. That's payment guaranteed for a positive review, or to withhold a negative review. This is ultimately what was offered to Andrew and TechTeamGB, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It basically amounts to payment for services by editing a review where it benefits the company. This is justified by paying the content creator for their time, albeit in exchange for the content creator's integrity. The differential between Payola and sponsored content ultimately is disclosure. The point of Payola is for it's not meant to be discussed. Payola is a term that might be used if a reviewer has a vested interest in the product doing well but doesn't disclose it, such as an analyst writing a white paper without disclosing the funding, or if your favourite content creator has financial investments in a company doing well. A declared paid-for article or video, known as sponsored content as we've covered, where the payment could either be for providing specific talking points or just for the sake of an article. Sponsored content or native advertising is more widely accepted in video than it is for written. Payola, as far as I'm aware, was more common in the West over a decade ago. Daily Tech, in 2007, conducted a behind-the-scenes analysis of which publishers and journalists would accept financial incentives to offer positive reviews. At the time, the number they came up with was 20%, and there's a link to the article in the description. As far as we're aware, based on conversations years old with global PR teams that I have a good rapport with, this sort of thing still happens in China. Journalists will approach companies asking for money in order to give good reviews, either with the product that they have sampled or ones that they've purchased themselves. This is similar to Amazon reviews, where a free product is given for a 5-star review. So it wouldn't surprise me if improperly trained former PR contacts that suddenly start covering a different region might not understand that Payola isn't the sort of thing that is done in a different region. This is ultimately what I think happened to Andrew at TechTeamGB. His contact through an MSI PR agency had recently moved from a Chinese PR agency team, and this is how they had operated over in that region, but failed to adapt for the local Europe region. The product Andrew had received did not live up to expectations, and hence the back and forth with a conversation about money, paying for time, and threatening of samples. There is also an aspect of advertising known as editorial sales, whereby a tech company may put pressure on a brand to do more reviews given that they have spent lots of money in advertising. Pushing ethics aside, one might expect the big companies to buy advertisements at the publications, or with content creators that give them the best reviews, or offer the best audience coupled with those positive reviews. For a lot of smaller creators, this can be a problem. Companies may turn around and say, we will give you X for pre-roll ads, but we want 2 reviews out of it. And that might actually be written into the contract. Now, those reviews might still be under the editorial control of the creator, and so they might be positive or negative, but negative ones might discourage that company from buying ads again, so it really plays on smaller creators' minds, and here we are still blurring the line. A company that advertises might be more amenable to that brand reviewing some of their more high-profile hardware, and help the creators through the next couple of months with the sort of content that may not have been able to be done without getting those samples. The final point on this video is that I want to cover how to approach a negative review, what happens when you write one, and how companies can react. One of the earliest hurdles in a tech journalist's career is how to approach positive and negative reviews. For a new journalist or content creator that has not ever had the opportunity to test the latest and greatest before, suddenly holding a review sample of the Halo product can be quite daunting. Here might be something up to 10 times more expensive than they've ever tested before, so of course it's going to be amazing from that perspective. Acquiring the technical knowledge to review these Halo products takes time to learn, and so there are multiple routes for that first review. Either remain fairly neutral until you have an understanding of that ecosystem, or just lavish on the praise. For content creators starting out, doing the lavishing praise route feels more natural, and also puts you in good stead for the vendor supplying the hardware, as they hope they can count on future positive reviews. It's a vicious cycle, especially when a mildly negative review can cut their creator off completely. For publications or channels with a sizable audience, a negative review is nothing new. It should be said though that there are a number of ways to frame a negative review. And from my experience, there can be 50 ways to say something does perform well or is bad, and each of these 50 ways can elicit different responses from the vendor at hand. Saying that something doesn't meet the expectations of the competition not create as much friction as saying it performs worse and it's not worth it. The latter of that is likely to cause a lot of friction. So part of this is how to present the content and how to manage the relationship with these vendors, especially with the diplomacy between the creator and the vendor. With the right ethos, one can deliver a simply devastating analysis while not being outright obnoxious. There are always discussions going on behind the scenes between creators and the PR agencies, and naturally how much of that potentially dirty laundry you air can affect the relationship. This is where it comes down to being mutually beneficial or offering mutually assured destruction of the relationship. I like to think that over the last decade, I've devised a good balance when it comes down to these relationships, even if that means 5-hour discussions with engineers. Part of that is also based on understanding of who does what, which is kind of the point of this video. So if a vendor gets a negative review, there are a few angles they can take. For a deeply negative and obnoxious review, the content creator can expect to be put on the blacklist. These companies, for all they're worth, don't have to work with anyone unless they don't want to. Unless there is some deeply nefarious activity going on for which you have evidence, then just calling out a vendor for a simple lack of perception into your specific part of the industry isn't going to do them or you any favours, because some of these companies actually don't have a view into your certain industry segment, even if they promote themselves as having done the market research. Know that if a review is negative, but analytically so, a vendor could still bring down that ban hammer. Some vendors, or some PR firms, are a lot more sensitive to others. Some of that comes down to experience. The best thing to do here is to keep an open dialogue. Give the vendor a heads up if a negative review is coming, like Andrew did with MSI, and give them a chance to respond, but also give them a reasonable time frame in which to respond. The best vendors, when paired with the most honest content, often engage with creators to improve the products. For example, at Anantech in the mid-2010s, we gave an LG monitor a negative review, but we had kept them in the loop, and we had told them what we'd found all along the way. We even tested more samples and saw the same result. We eventually went live with a review, explaining the situation from both points of view. LG took that feedback and sent a second revision our way, which solved most of our qualms. Obviously, one of the key points here comes down to how the PR agency sees the content creator. Some of these agencies don't care about technical feedback. They have a few numbers to worry about, such as number of reviews, number of awards, and how many of those reviews are positive. For these PR agency contacts, their bonuses might be dependent on these numbers. So for a lot of smaller media outlets, they are seen only as numbers in the spreadsheet. Did they review the sample we sent, and was it a positive review? Simply based on those numbers might push an outlet up or down the stack for review samples. If there's a negative review, depending on the region, there might be additional incentives to stop that review coming to light. This is where we cycle back to the issues that TechTeamGB had with a PR agent working on behalf of a regional office for MSI. How you talk to press relations representatives can define your relationship with them. In an ideal world, there has to be some level of mutual trust between the two, as well as a shared degree of honesty and openness even when dealing with thorny topics. The issue comes down to what type of PR representative you are dealing with. As I've covered in this piece, the attitude of PR representatives differs wildly, from those just chasing numbers, looking for the next bonus or doing the bare minimum, to representatives that care deeply about the product and the company. It comes down to whether you're dealing with a company direct, a PR agency that's super lowballed a geolocation contract, or something in between. Now, it should be noted that part of this problem when dealing with a new PR rep is that without some initial interaction, it's hard to determine where they are on that scale. Similarly, the reverse is true. If you are new to the industry and you want to be a part of that press ensemble, then the PR agent with a lifetime experience won't necessarily know what your standard is, or how you might react to how they operate things. Of course, when you pair media who don't know how to communicate with PR to a PR agent that's only in it for the numbers, create worst of both worlds. One of the best bits of advice I ever got from a number of mentors when I started in this industry is that PR agents are never explicitly your friends. Their job is to be friendly, to showcase the company they represent in the best light, and as a result, some of that will come through in their actions with you. However, it is very much a business transaction. The likelihood of that communication continuing after one side leaves the industry is very low. This is what separates friends from friendly industry peers. There are probably over 200 industry contacts that I've had drinks with at events, had meals, had discussions about life, future, and products. In that role, I can imagine a number of them agreeing to a favour or two in a personal emergency, mostly by virtue of our professional relationship, or even help look for a future career path. For example, I've helped a few. But I doubt any of them would be long-term out-of-industry friends. Even the ones that I know live less than a mile away, I only ever see them as part of work functions. With that in mind, as a member of the media, any conversation you move into with a PR agent, or even with an engineer, should be approached from two perspectives. First, from the media perspective, what is the goal of this conversation? Or what should I say to elicit the responses I require? Secondly, put yourself in the shoes of the PR representative. The longer you've worked with them, the easier this is, and it actually becomes more difficult when the rep for a company changes. So, in the mind of the PR representative, are they after quick numbers? Do they know who to speak to if you have a question? If this is going to be a conversation where we talk about negatives, will they be able to see the reasons for why I'm saying what I'm saying? Am I considered high profile enough for what I'm about to say to have any serious clout? Do they have the position to pass my commentary on to the people that know? Is this something more serious than the person I'm talking to, and will I be heard? How you approach these conversations, much like when giving interviews, is a skill in of itself. For those in the media, every conversation is the ability to learn, identify trends and patterns, and hone that skill to optimize the best out of every conversation. For the lack of better description, it's an exercise in conversational and professional psychology. Anyone that can accurately infer how their contacts will react to a question or a comment can tailor that question or comment to maximize the potential response, identifying what can be asked, what can't be asked, or what is useless to ask. Some of this is also down to rapport. Having a strong professional standing with an agent will open up doors that a poor standing might remain closed. To the case in point here with the issues between TechTeamGB and the MSI PR agent. After a couple of weeks of limited communication after faults were found, Andrew took a step forward to essentially force a response from a PR agent that seemingly had no intent in responding, ideally to delay the review. Then at the point where the agent offered to pay him off, and then subsequently threatened sampling, Andrew identified that the situation was bigger than the person he was speaking to, and the only way to go above that was to make it public. So, for those starting out in the industry, where possible, ask to be a fly on the wall of a senior editor in those conversations. If you're working for a publisher, absorb those interactions as much as possible. For those who are new, starting with their own enterprise, ensure that you have a spiel nailed down about what you do and why, and where possible, point to any professional reasons why you're in your current position. Even with my position as senior editor in Antech, even with interviews of C-level executives from the top companies, I'm always learning how people interact with each other and how these PR agents respond to different sorts of language. The inevitable question is, can you succeed in tech media if you are new, without resorting to bending to the PR agent's every whim? I say absolutely. Honesty and rigor are two key tenets of that, even if you are more entertainment-based for your audience. But learning how to approach and talk to an agent as a peer rather than a sneer, and optimizing your professional interactions goes a very long way. There's no need to sell your soul, but there's also no need to throw it away at the first bump. Thank you for listening to TechTechPotato production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, what's your minimum specification?